This is lecture number 8 in Introduction to Politics. I'd like to discuss today two major tendencies which often collide in terms of the bigger way that people understand how civilizations are meant to engage one another. As the Cold War came to an end in the late 1980s, Samuel Huntington initially wrote an article which then turned into a book called The Clash of Civilizations. Huntington's argument, he was coming from a Republican position, he was an advisor to Ronald Reagan. He argued that in the clash of ideology, liberal capitalist West was pitted against communism. And over time, eventually, the liberal capitalist won that ideological warfare. And the tendency was, as the 1980s came to an end and the early 1990s emerged, is that many thought, well, this was the time now for a peace dividend. Money would not need to be spent anymore in research and militarism, manufacturing, the most sophisticated weapons of destruction, and the money could now be directed towards building peace, following the United Nations General Assembly, in making the world a much more just and peaceful place. Huntington, though, argued, he said, before one puts guns back in the holster and naively moves in an ironical, dovish, peacemaking direction, he argued there is going to be a much more ominous threat that is coming down the road to the West. And the West should not put its head in the sand and ignore this. And he argued that this is going to be the clash of civilizations, which he argued was far more formidable, far more dangerous, far more threatening to the West than the clash of ideology, because it went much deeper. It was much more historical. It was part of the whoop and the weft of peoples, their languages, their histories. And he listed a variety of civilizations which the West had best be on guard against. And if it didn't, the West would be overwhelmed, and its liberal democratic victory in the Cold War would be, in that sense, a Pyrrhic victory. It would be a short-lived victory because we would be overwhelmed by some of these emerging civilizations. Two of the civilizations he listed as a threat, he listed a variety of them, but two of them, I could mention a third one also, have certainly become empirically present to the First World or the Western world since then. One became very obvious shortly after what was occurring actually at the same time, and it seemed to reinforce Huntington's argument, was that the Islamic world was going to be a great threat to Western civilization. And it was in 1990 that Hussein went into Kuwait. The West went in and had to deal with Hussein, and of course there were all sorts of boycotts in Iraq at the time. It was shortly thereafter also that Salman Rushdie's Satanic Verses were published, and out of Iran came the fatwa on his life, powerful work by Salman Rushdie. And a certain right-wing form of Islam would brook no questioning of a certain read of the Quran. And then what shortly followed, which no one will forget, was 9/11, of course. And so for Huntington, he argued that Islam was a potential threat. And needless to say, there were many Muslims who came forward and argued this extreme right wing of jihadist forms of Islam and fatwas and Khomeini, this does not represent moderate Islam, much less liberal forms of Islam. But Huntington's argument was that this is a civilization that the West has to be alert and attuned to, because elements of it have violent tendencies. And so 9/11 became that great tragedy for many in the West, and Huntington would argue, yeah, you were simply naive and not aware of what's actually going on in this sense. And so there was a clash, obviously, in the Muslim world about who defines Islam, whose interpretation of the Hadith, the Quran, and all of these sorts of things. And so Huntington's argument here was be alert to what's going on. The second great civilization, he argued, was Confucian China. He argued this is a great civilization that has a history older than the West, much older than the West. It's a collective organization. It's an obedience organization, a command obedience. It respects the elders. It respects the head of state. The state is like the mother, the father, the parent, and the citizens are the children. And so no brooking seriously of opposition. And so the second civilization, he argued, that the West must be alert to is a growing, maturing Chinese civilization. He pointed out Russia also is a civilization that one has to be alert to. And if the West is naive, even though USSR turned Russia, many of its client states broke off after the USSR. Some would argue it is the sleeping bear at the present time, and don't poke it too much. It at this point does not have the strength of China, but over a period of time it's rebuilding after going through its own dissipation after the end of the USSR. But what Huntington's argument was is that civilizations and cultures, it's a clash mentality. So out of this comes political realism. And it is this form of political realism that if people are not attuned to and alert to, they may become the victims of it in terms of naive peacemaking, naive dovishness. They may be playing into the very hands of Machiavellian power brokers. And so you have the hard realist clash of civilizations model of Samuel Huntington. The other model, which very much is a part of what we would call the idealist, ironical model, is the coexistence model. Many thinkers have articulated that. One of the best known, of course, would be Edward Said. And he himself is a Palestinian. He certainly has seen the consequences of clash of civilization, in his case, between the Jewish-Israeli state and his own Palestinian people. He's often seen clashes within the Palestinian people, and he was one of the leading critics of Israel, but also one of the leading critics of the leadership in the PLO, and also including Yasser Arafat and many others. Argued very clearly that an ironical, a coexistence model, whether between Jews and Christians and Muslims and others, was the only way forward, because if the clash model dominated, it led to fragmentation, led to war, it led to depleting of resources, a wasting of human energy, and coexistence was the best way forward. He tried to use his own model, obviously, of the Israeli-Palestinian situation. And at that micro level of coexistence, of course, Edward Said lived to see that, in fact, there were obviously coexistence between some Jews and Palestinians, but at a structural political level, in fact, clash dominates. And so at the micro level that Edward Said understood very well, coexistence was an ideal, clash was the reality. And how does one, from the mountaintop of coexistence idealism, deal with the valley of clash and realism? These two models then, in terms of one embodying a form of political realism that sees very much humans in a Hobbesian war of all against all, and power clashes, take the position that coexistence is an interesting ideal, but it's disconnected to the world of ethnic clashes, economic clashes, class clashes, color clashes, economic clashes, and that people by their very nature are primarily interested in their own wants and needs, and he or she who will protect those wants and needs, and those who threaten it, then you go to war with or clash in that sense. But Huntington's argue is that there are these great civilizations. Now, we always need to ask ourselves, does such a position perpetuate the problem of clash by articulating at the heart of politics and international relations is realism? And where does that lead? And are civilizations, as Huntington has been critiqued, are civilizations homogeneous? Is there a homogeneous Russian civilization, a homogeneous Chinese civilization, a homogeneous Islamic civilization, a homogeneous First Nations civilization, a homogeneous Black civilization, a homogeneous gender civilization? Are blocks of people, can they be reduced to such a simplistic categories, and are not civilizations themselves complex and have their own internal clashes? And so Huntington's thesis, as one begins to deconstruct it, leads to the position that in fact there are clashes within civilizations, and you'll often get within civilizations certain people will have affinity to other civilizations other than their own. And so this coexistence can be used as a model by which people within each civilization cross over, and they have more affinities with one another than people within their own civilization itself. And so the coexistence model, the clash of civilization model, these have become significant ways of interpreting the future forward. Often they are seen as the ideological lens through which to interpret politics and the way forward. One has to ask, of course, by way of conclusion, what is the truth in the clash of civilizations model? What is the blind spots or the Achilles heel in the truth of civilizations model? What is the truth in the coexistence model? And what is the blind spots in the coexistence model? And is there a way to bring together in a much more thoughtful and subtle way the best of the clash model, the best of the coexistence, while recognizing when they become homogeneous arguments, the tragedy that follows in misinterpreting, misunderstanding how to bring together for the purpose of healthy global civilizations a better world to live in.